Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform from which we explore the past of Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean, where the country is at the present and what the potential is for the future, as we take on a diverse array of topics connected to this country. Today we're talking about social media, the scope and significance for Sri Lanka. And to join us for this discussion, we have a director and co-founder of #Generation. He was a recipient of the Queen's Young Leaders Award in 2017. He was also a Sri Lankan youth delegate to the United Nations. His first degree is from the University of Colombo. His master's thereafter is from the London School of Economics and Politics, where he is currently reading for his PhD. Senel Wanniarchchi is our guest today on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Thank you, Senel, for joining us and giving us of your time. Let's start talking about social media in Sri Lanka, relatively new phenomenon, relatively I would stress. Could you take us through its origins in the country, how it actually came into being?
Sure, yeah, thank you for having me, George, as well. Now, if you think of the internet as a whole globally, the history of the internet as we know it now is actually from science fiction, right? Historically, people thought of what we use as the internet now, a platform which can fit on our pockets, that people can use to talk with each other across the globe, was actually in the work of science fiction, like from our own Arthur C. Clarke's. But the internet as we use it today was actually almost a military experiment of the US military during the time of the Cold War. Now, as you know better than me, the Cold War was not only a military exercise, it was also a technological, astronomical, and so on. And it was during this context that the internet as we know it now emerged. And the first email was actually sent from Stanford University to UCLA, the University of California, and the word that was sent was login, and the computer crashed before you could type the full word because the computers weren't advanced. So it was actually in this context that the internet as we know it today emerged. Now, if you think of social media, the history of Facebook, for instance, which is the most popular in Sri Lanka as well, goes back to Harvard University, where there's a movie about this. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, has contested the story, but it goes back to this story that these guys developed an app which can actually measure the attractiveness of other students. So it was kind of a trivial thing that they came up with. But today it's also exploded. Everyone's on it. A lot of us are on it. So for me, I think now historians say that the history also shapes the way these platforms work and operate. So for me, if you think about kind of the surveillance that's happening on the internet, the way that data is extracted and so on, for me, it kind of goes back to that moment where it was actually initially a military experiment. And if you think about where a lot of us use the internet, where women are treated on the internet, objectification and so on, then it also goes back to that moment where social media was concepted. So for me, in some ways, that is the beginning. But of course, that's a very pessimistic outlook of the whole thing, where it's actually also a wonderful phenomenon. But we can talk more about that side of thing later.
Absolutely, because there are so many forms of social media now. I mean, so many different platforms that can be accessed. How active are Sri Lankans on all of these different forms?
So the internet was introduced to Sri Lanka in around 1995 with Sri Lanka Telecom and so on. And since then, the internet is also becoming increasingly popular. Today, based on some analysis, about 35% of the country uses internet, and some push it back to about 42%. So that's kind of the average amount of Sri Lankans that use the internet. But if you think of mobile phones, for instance, they are much more popular. About 80% of the country uses mobile phones. And the number of SIMs in circulation actually more than the number of people, because a lot of us have more than one SIM cards. So it is extremely popular, but also in some ways not as much as you'd think, because 40% is also, that means about 60-70% of the country is also left behind. So a significant part of the country is there, but a significant part of the country is also not there. This has also created its own problems. In some ways, it's democratized information, access to information, and so on. But in some ways, people are also getting left behind. And what some of the studies are also saying is that if you've already achieved some level of progress economically in terms of education, in terms of access to technology, then the internet can help you with class mobility, economic mobility, accessing opportunities. But if you're already beyond, below that threshold, if you're already below in terms of education, access to technology and different tools, then actually the internet in some ways contributes to existing disparities, because it's already leaving some more people behind. So there's both sides.
Exactly, there are two sides to that. So when we come back to the Sri Lankan Understanding in the next segment, we're going to talk about some of the main challenges that we see in social media today in Sri Lanka, and also the question of regulation. When we return with the Sri Lankan Understanding, as we are in conversation with Senel Wanniarchchi. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. Our topic for discussion today is social media, the scope and significance for Sri Lanka. And we are in conversation with Senel Wanniarchchi. Senel, before the break, you talked to us about the concept, how it actually originated, where it originated from, what was the main thinking behind it. But when we look at it today, anyone with a mobile phone has access to social media. You can be accessing information, you can also be creating information. Now, what is the main challenge then to mainstream media?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because like you're saying, this the separation of the mainstream media and the social media also is becoming also increasingly blurred. Because if you think about Sri Lanka, for instance, today, the mainstream media in some ways also has a grip over social media. Now, for instance, if you think about the biggest, most popular Facebook pages, they're actually ones run by the mainstream media. They're the ones run by the mainstream media, TV stations, radio stations, and so on. If you think of the most popular gossip sites, now as we know, gossip sites are a hugely famous phenomenon in this country. Gossip is one of the most Googled words in the country as well. They're also controlled to a large extent by the mainstream press. If you think of the most popular YouTube channels, for instance, on YouTube, they're also, I mean, not all of them, but on the top 10, for instance, there's a good 3 or 4 that are controlled by the mainstream media. But also the mainstream media in some ways is also struggling because of the way they use to create information. So they also need to play a lot of games in terms of catch up. But the challenge there is also then how do you catch up with these technologies, with the current trends, but also maintain minimum standards in terms of ethics, in terms of accuracy, and so on. Because with social media, things also need to be quite fast. So the first person to tweet actually gets the highest amount of traction, because everyone is waiting for that news. So how do you then be the first person to get the news out, but also still maintain minimum ethics and standards and accuracy. Which is a huge problem, particularly in terms of disinformation, for instance. The amount of disinformation that is being circulated is huge. And as we know, of course, social media is to blame in some sense, but also there have been cases where kind of the mainstream media has also contributed to these problems. So social media has enabled us to kind of share information widely and extremely fast. And this has kind of created its own sets of challenges as well. So I think the main challenge for the mainstream media is to kind of figure out how to balance that and how to maintain those minimum ethics. And as we know, in a lot of ways, the mainstream media is also struggling to maintain those ethics in terms of respecting people's privacy, maintaining those standards in terms of ethics and get accuracy. So the mainstream media needs to do a lot better job in that sense as well.
Absolutely. When we talk about social media, we talked about accessibility to it. You can access information, also create information, and it gives you amazing freedom at that point. But one thing we've also got to distinguish is between the freedom of speech and hate speech. Now, do we need to regulate this? If so, what kind of regulation is paramount?
Yeah, I think that's an important question and also extremely current, right? Especially for our context, but also globally. This is a problem that social media companies are thinking about states, civil society, and so on. Because I remember when I was younger, when I was a student, there was, for instance, the Arab Spring that was happening across West Asia. And I remember reading about it, seeing it on the newspapers, the TV, and being quite inspired about how people used social media as a tool to kind of figure out where to meet in the city and protest and challenge authoritarianism, challenge dictators, and actually even lead change. Now, in that sense, there was a big kind of positive outlook in terms of social media, where it's a tool that was used for democracy, to fight for freedom, and so on. Now, of course, looking back at those incidents, you can maybe think about these things a bit more critically, but at the time, it was seen extremely positively. Now today, these same tools, we are also thinking about them a lot more skeptically, because we've seen those same tools that were used then for democracy, for freedom, also to challenge these same things. We are seeing kind of authoritarian regimes using social media, where you're seeing how data is being extracted to manipulate the way people thinking about it, with also even to intervene in the case of global elections and so on as well. So there are these conversations that are happening. Now, a significant part of those conversations is also what you said about hate speech. Now, hate speech, again, in this country is also not a new phenomenon, and also something that's not, again, just limited to social media. We can't blame kind of all of the structural issues in terms of race and ethnicity in this country to social media, when historically, for instance, when the Single Only Act was passed, there was no Facebook. So we can't say kind of all of it is related to social media, but a significant part of it today is because of the hyper connectivity and so on. And we know that kind of speech through globally, again, with kind of research and so on, we know that speech is also not just speech. Kind of hurtful speech and harmful speech is bad in itself, kind of for the psychological impact and so on. But there's also been research that links it to physical violence. For instance, with Rwanda, we know that the genocide, kind of before the genocide, the media, especially radio, played a key role kind of bringing these two communities against each other. So then speech is also not just speech, it also kind of enables violence. And we've seen it happen, of course, in this country as well, in different parts of the country. A good example is also what happened in Ampara at some point in 2018, where kind of there was a restaurant which was set fire to based on allegations of sterilization pills. And later it was proven by the government itself that it wasn't the case. So in such a case, it is completely kind of, everyone knows that there is an issue. Hate speech is a problem. And in this country in particular, hate speech also doesn't only take the form of kind of slurs and kind of racial slurs and so on. It also takes the form of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and rumors about different communities, which maybe if you're not familiar with the context, like the sterilization pills, then you wouldn't really realize that it's hate speech. But actually it has led to creating mistrust between communities and also created physical violence. Now, while that is also true, there is also a big anxiety about regulation, especially legal forms of regulation, because in context where there is a democratic deficit, laws that are created to kind of deal with things like hate speech and disinformation can often be used to curtail the freedom of expression. Now, this is also a challenge that a lot of people are discussing and talking about globally as well. That once these laws are passed, then they are on the books, and they could be used to target dissent and criticism and art and so on. So on the one hand, there is an issue, of course, but on the other hand, then there is this fear and anxiety over the law, because the law can also be used and manipulated as a tool to kind of support power, which we know can happen and has happened as well.
Leading on from that point of regulation, Senel, do you think that the fact that people can say whatever they want to say, and they do say whatever they want to say on social media, makes them that much more vulnerable, exposes you that much more to society? People begin to know a lot more about you, because people will Facebook about everything that they do. They might tweet about everything under the sun, whether they have the knowledge of it or not. So doesn't this become a very risky, dicey situation here?
Yeah, I think it's extremely true. And these are also not things we're taught about too much in school. Right? I remember when I was in school, I mean, we did have a great ICT program. But as part of that, we learned kind of MS Word, the history of computers, how they used to be kind of as giant as rooms back then, and kind of X person was the father of the computer and so on. So this kind of, I mean, very important stuff. But also not really things that I think about and use in my day-to-day life. Skills like kind of when I see something on Facebook, how do I really verify whether it's true or not? What's an ethical way to engage on social media? How do you respect each other on social media? I think these are also extremely important skills, and globally they call it critical media literacy. And this is not something that we learn from our schools, in our universities. So I think it's also extremely important. I think parallel to that, we also need things like counter narratives, alternative narratives, so organized efforts to create more positive content using new trends, using new kind of creative ways and so on. Because in some ways, the groups creating hate speech, of course, some of it is organic as well, but some of it is also organized. So if we are to challenge those narratives, then we also need to have organized ways of organizing more kind of positive, creative content. I think then we also need fact checks and so on, which can also counter the disinformation as well. And those also need to be thought out a lot more as opposed to kind of just objective pie charts. How can we kind of disseminate those fact checks in creative ways? Because a lot of people are not interested in seeing pie charts and kind of fact checks that are very technical. How do you put it out in creative ways and so on as well? So these are things that are, I think, very important to think about, and a lot of people are, of course, working on these things, but not enough. I think we need to put a lot more effort into working on these
And that's where there's a lot more scope in this particular field, and people want to get into this field. There's a lot more that can be done because a lot more that should be done. As you mentioned, even if you take narratives, if you take examples, case studies and go into those, we're going to probably be able to understand the phenomenon that much more. Because very often we see a photograph and we make up a decision. We say something in response to it. But there are several angles of that photograph, and they've done those studies where they've shown you same situation from different angles, and it's a very different picture. So when we come back with the Sri Lankan Understanding in our next segment, we'll be talking about the inclusivity of youth and the role that youth play in this much bigger process. When we return with the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. Our topic for discussion today is social media. We're looking at the scope and the significance for Sri Lanka. We're in conversation with Senel Wanniarchchi. Senel, you head an initiative which focuses on youth and of course the media, social media as well. How inclusive is social media? Do we find sectors of society being excluded? If so, is it divisive in this country?
Yeah, I think in some ways social media is also a reflection of our own society. So the online is in some ways a reflection of the offline as well. The same kind of forms of discrimination, prejudice and inequality that exist in the offline world also exist online. This can be based on kind of class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and all of these different types of inequalities in our society. Now, if you think of kind of basic access, economic access in terms of class and so on, it's also a bit like if you look at Sri Lanka's map in terms of access to technology and Sri Lanka's map in terms of kind of economic disparities between the different provinces, it's almost equal. Kind of the biggest number of social media users are in Western province, like in terms of the economic spaces and so on. And it's the same with kind of the least accessible areas. For instance, the plantation sector provinces, areas like Monoragala and Mullaitivu, for instance, are far more behind than other parts of the country. So in terms of just like the offline world, those same gaps, disparities exist as well. Same with, I think, gender in a lot of ways as well. It's not the same way, for instance, to be a man standing at a bus point and a woman standing at a bus point. And it's the same being a man and a woman on Facebook, for instance. The way you're treated, the way your photos are responded to, and so on, is also completely different. So all of these disparities exist. For instance, for a person with disabilities, of course, in some ways, technology is a great enabler because it allows you to access things maybe that you can't. But also in some ways, a lot of things online are also still not accessible. So with technological advances, these things kind of are catching up in some ways. But in a lot of ways also, we are still very behind. And a lot of us are also unaware. Like in some ways, until very recently, I didn't know that, for instance, a lot of visually handicapped blind colleagues that I work with are not able to read some types of PDF documents. So how do we make our own work inclusive as well? A lot of us are unaware about these things as well. So I think social media in that sense is extremely unequal, just like our offline worlds, and we need to make them more accessible. In a time like COVID, for instance, these disparities also increase even more because our reliance on social media is that much higher. We use it for education and sometimes even to sometimes maybe even learn about what's going on in the country, about the pandemic itself. So then our basic access to education, health and so on depend on these sources of information and being able to access these sources of information. So we need to take, I think, much bigger steps to ensure that these disparities are addressed and we level these disparities. And I think a lot more needs to be done in that sense.
Because whether we like it or not, Senel, going into the future, technology is the future. There is a technological revolution that is sweeping across the world. Whether Sri Lankans want to or don't want to, they have to ride this wave, or it's going to just sweep over us. I guess hashtag generation is doing a lot in that regard in terms of making people that much more aware through the wonderful work that you do through your initiative as well. How ready are we as a country, as a people? What more do we need to do? How do we need to become that much more aware of social media?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do want to say we are not ready, because I mean, in some ways we are. For instance, I work at a co-working space which is filled with people who work in technology, and they are some of the smartest minds in this country. So in terms of kind of access, in terms of the skills, in terms of the types of things they're able to develop, we are super advanced, and we are able to, I think, compete with a lot of countries. But also in terms of then how do we use it generally in the social sense, I think a lot of the problems we have in our regular world, in our regular life, then also come to social media, but because of some of the characteristics inherent to the internet, like maybe anonymity, the speed at which things travel on the internet and so on, then some of these problems become worse. So in that sense, then we are not ready. In some ways we are, but in some ways we are not. And I think what we need is a shift in terms of education as well, the skills that we teach young people. In terms of being able to critically use these platforms, kind of not share everything that your friend sends on WhatsApp to everyone you know, because sometimes people add this one line in the end saying kind of forwarded as received, and then that means that you're kind of not responsible for this message that you're sharing, because it just came to you, but actually that doesn't mean anything, right? If you're sharing something, then you are responsible for it. So how do you critically consume information? These are not skills that we are taught in school. How do you respect someone? How do you respectfully have a conversation? Because of course we talk about hate speech and so on, but disagreement is also essential. We should be able to disagree on things, debate on things, but how do you do that respectfully without kind of resorting to slurs and all of these things? How can we have that kind of discussion? And also in terms of empathy, right? How do we kind of engage in society empathy? With empathy, how do we deal with people from different communities with empathy? These are also not types of things that we are taught in school. Of course, we learn some of these things at kind of the religion class and so on, but they're not taught to us as kind of being able to live in a society that's diverse and so on. And on the internet, for instance, that is also extremely important. So some of the content on the internet as well in some ways is quite divisive, because in our country we also speak different languages, right? So some people speak the Sinhala language, some people speak the Tamil language, and some people also use the internet purely in English as well. But a lot of the content on the internet is also still available in English. So then that also creates some issues. Of course, there are some solutions with Google Translate and all of these solutions that are coming up as well. But in terms of being able to read each other's content, I think, for instance, if you look at how some of the Sinhala gossip sites report a news and the Tamil gossip sites report the same news, it's very different articulations of the same story. So then how do you see that just because you read something, also someone wrote it, and that person possibly has different agendas, including kind of financial motives, political motives? How do you just think about it? And it applies, of course, to the online world as much as it does to the offline world as well. When you consume any type of information, even if you're watching the news or reading the newspaper, know that someone actually wrote it, and everyone has an agenda. People sometimes make mistakes, and that it's not 100% true. And I think these basic skills of critical thinking are not taught to us in school, and they're so important for living in today's world, as much as learning the ICTs and the languages and all of these other things as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, Senel, there, where we as individuals need to be, we're very conscious of what we should be receiving, what the state should be giving us, what society should be giving us, what our educational institutions should be giving us. We're very aware of those things. Are we aware of our responsibilities in terms of what we are doing towards society? Do we have to comment on everything that is shared on Facebook, every tweet that comes out there, every WhatsApp message? Do we need to forward it? Do we need to understand it that much more? Understand the context in which it comes. There are not just two sides, there are several sides. In an argument, there might be your side, my side, and probably reality of what actually happened. Yeah. This is where biases come in, prejudices come in. You talked about ownership at the end of the day of these issues, of these topics. How prepared are we? How ready are we? How conscious are we of what we are doing? So I guess whilst we're looking at social media, there's a much bigger picture to look at as well, whether it's the online world or the offline world. We have a responsibility in both, and very often the online world is a reflection of the offline world. So we're making those mistakes in the reality, and we're going into the same thing in the virtual world as well. And this is where we've got to become that much more conscious of information that we receive, consideration of information that we share, and also being able to decipher between what needs to be responded to and what doesn't need to be responded to. Social media is very complex. Social media certainly is the future. We're going to see it growing exponentially in the years and decades ahead. The ways and means through which we use it, the understanding of it, and how practically we are able to go about using various modalities, various platforms, is what is going to form the future of this country. Being that much more aware becomes that much more important. Thank you, Senel, once again for joining us on the Sri Lankan Understanding. And we wrap up this session at that point where we looked at social media and we looked at the scope and significance for Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us.